People are like, Sasha Banks, you have to watch Sasha Banks. I think it was that hype that kind of just, my heart was just like, oh my God, I feel like I have to live up to this.
We're all so different, and I know we're really going to be the star of the show.
It's something that you can't explain, and it's a feeling that I don't think you could match.
Because, you know, in NXT, the crowd and the audience saw us evolve into what we were. So they knew Charlotte's story, they knew Sasha Banks' story, they knew Becky Lynch's story. And then when you get to the main roster, it's like, okay, we're going to package you. Here you are. Call it the Divas Revolution.
Those girls that were watching that era started to become, you know, where they were wanting to get in this industry. And what they wanted out of it was change.
The legacy of women in pro wrestling goes back decades. From legends like Mae Young, the Fabulous Moolah, to Wendy Richter, sensational Sherry Martel, Medusa Michelli, aka Alundra Blaze, and then later on to Trish Stratus and Lita, there have been numerous females who have rocked the ring just as well as the men. Even tongue-in-cheek wrestling programs like Glow, Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, provided female characters that leapt off the screen and captivated audiences with their unique ability to tell a story in and outside of the ring. Many of these stars have gone on to become legends in the wrestling world and are fondly remembered by fans from the 50s until today. During the 1990s, things took a bit of a turn as the Monday Night Wars, which started with a trading of a women's division from the WWF to WCW, slowly evaporated into bra and panties matches featuring women who were known more for their looks than their ring acumen. After the war ended, the WWE continued with women's wrestling, but it changed the title of the division to a Divas division, a term that was to promote the strength and confidence of its female stars. While there were many less than talented wrestlers who populated the division during this time period, there was still a healthy amount of talented performers, including Trish Stratus, Lita, Victoria, Ivory, and others who made the Divas division more than just eye candy. However, by the mid-2000s, the Divas division matches were seen as little more than pee breaks between featured matches on big pay-per-views or throwaway angles involving some pretty petty and stereotypical storyline angles.
Shell, pigs flew that night. You're right, Ray. But could you imagine if both pigs flew? What if Beth would have jumped on us too?
The women were often given very little time to apply their craft in the ring, and this led to many mainstream fans to consider women's wrestling as simply a gimmick. At the same time, Chicago-based promotion Shimmer began running shows that featured women wrestlers exclusively. To this day, Shimmer is still considered one of the most prominent women's wrestling organizations in the world. Over in Japan, women's wrestling, and pro wrestling in general, has an entirely different image to the public. A long history of entertaining grapplers like Aja Kong, Bull Nakano, Kana, Akira Hokuto, and others performed at a high level in the ring. Not considered to be just eye candy, these organizations proved to the pro wrestling world that women's wrestling could be a whole lot more. In the WWE, however, this was not the case, and it would take a revolution to change that. When NXT became its own division within WWE, there was a strong push to feature women wrestlers as just that, wrestlers. With a crop of new talent coming in, who had varying degrees of experience, Triple H's pet project got off to a rocky start, but it wasn't long until performers like Emma, Paige, and Natalya started to stand out from the usual diva shtick that was prominent on the main roster. The torch was passed from this early generation when Charlotte, the daughter of Ric Flair and one of the best athletes in the business as a whole, won the Women's Championship in a fantastic match against Natalya at NXT TakeOver in May of 2014. Charlotte had been part of a kind of Mean Girls faction in NXT, who at this time were still figuring out the characters for the women. During this time, she had established herself with the Full Sail crowd as a truly talented performer who had a natural gift passed down from her father. During 2014, Charlotte defended her championship against all comers in NXT, besting all other women in the division. This would lead to several clashes during the remainder of the year, many of which included 3 other women wrestlers, Bayley, Sasha Banks, and Becky Lynch. As the year came to a close, Charlotte and Sasha Banks would be featured as the semi-main event during NXT TakeOver R Evolution, to this date still one of the best NXT TakeOvers ever, for the Women's Championship. It is to be noted that this championship was specifically called a women's title and not a Divas title, even though the commenters would slip up from time to time and use the word Divas during their matches. Banks and Charlotte had an amazing match, and it was one that personally for me solidified that these women were on another level entirely from the Divas on the main roster. The match nearly stole the show and garnered respect for the challenger, even in defeat. Sasha continued her chase for Charlotte's championship, and during this time established herself as a heel in the developmental territory. She would finally attain success during a fatal 4-way match at NXT TakeOver Rival by not only winning the match, but pinning Charlotte in the end. Banks quickly became a favorite heel among the NXT crowd, who loved her performances no matter how dastardly they became. She continued to put on amazing displays in the ring, as well as promos that felt right for her developing character of The Boss. She had help, as any good heel would, in the form of her business associate, Becky Lynch. While considered by many to be the weakest of the 4 at the time, Becky Lynch had been a rather generic and stereotypical character upon first coming to NXT. Having had experience back in her homeland of Ireland, WWE saw to go overboard with the Irish gimmick, but fortunately that was supplanted by a more punk rock image later on. As she was friends with the champ, Lynch was seen as little more than Sasha's lackey until a rift between the two, who made a point to state that their characters weren't friends but in it for mutual benefit, saw Lynch wanting her shot at the championship. The two would meet at NXT TakeOver Unstoppable, where Lynch put up a valiant fight against Banks, who was portrayed as the favorite in the match. This was to be an uphill battle for Lynch, who nearly won the championship with the Disarmer, but ultimately fell to the Banks statement. After the match, Lynch's performance had won over the crowd so much that she got a standing ovation, and in one of the truly coolest moments from an NXT show, the crowd began to sing her theme song to a teary-eyed Lynch. Once again, another star had been made in the women's division. Sasha would go on to reign as champion, but one challenger was starting to make a lot of noise with the fans. The ultimate hot, nerdy girl, Bayley's whole persona is that of a superfan who made it to the ring. Colorful, bubbly, often geeky, but always lovable, Bayley had managed to make a larger-than-life character out of her tomboy persona that resonated with young, old, male, and female fans of NXT. However, she was unable to win many matches despite her popularity. With her back against the wall, Bayley reasserted herself and racked up a winning streak in her pursuit of Sasha Banks for the NXT Women's Championship. Banks looked at Bayley as a laughable challenger. Sasha had been fighting wars with Charlotte, Lynch, and others during her reign as champion, and Bayley was not a serious contender given how many times she had already beaten her. Bayley was determined to prove Sasha wrong, and at NXT TakeOver Brooklyn, the fangirl's dream would become a reality. In what many consider to be match of the year for 2015, Banks and Bayley put on an amazing show, showing not only their amazing skills in the ring, but also a seasoned ability to tell a story in the ring, something that many on the main roster hadn't been able to achieve. Bayley would win the championship, and following the match, Charlotte and Becky Lynch, who were now on the main roster along with Sasha, who was doing double duty, all entered the ring and broke kayfabe for a modern-day version of a curtain call. The four women embraced, breaking character as a callback of sorts to the infamous curtain call done in 1996, when members of the Clique broke character as a send-off to Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, who were heading to WCW. This curtain call was different, as it was a symbolic end to the year and a half of tremendous matches, character development, and friendship between the four women who had truly changed women's wrestling in the WWE. What they had done by their performances had made all WWE fans clamor for how NXT produced women's wrestling as opposed to the main roster, who were still doing the Divas style of matches. Stephanie McMahon saw what her husband was able to accomplish in NXT with the female wrestlers and wanted to bring that to the main roster. For weeks, there were teases of a women's revolution that was supposed to be happening in women's wrestling, and was, just not on the main roster. With everyone from Paige to the Bella Twins claiming to be responsible for it, the true women who had made this revolution happen were brought up to the main roster in 2015, well, all except for Bayley, to inject new life into the Divas division. The foundations for it had already been laid by Paige and AJ Lee, who had recently left the company, who both tried to bring integrity to the women's roster that was dominated by the less than talented Bella Twins. It seemed as if everything was going right. Fans were excited about seeing more competitive matches between the women on the main roster, and this was all solidified when the word Divas was officially dropped and WrestleMania rechristened the championship to once again be known as a women's championship.
Do you think we can end this on a hug?
One of the major criticisms of WWE over the last 6 or 7 years is their ability to take talented characters who are beloved initially and diminish their stars. Many of the stars, if not most, who were called up from NXT to the main roster were celebrated with huge fanfare, only to be seen in a lesser light a few months later due to bad booking, silly skits, a lack of confidence by management, and a variety of other factors that made fans scratch their heads and at sometimes even become angry at how stars, who were presented a certain way in NXT, were floundering on the main roster. The Four Horsewomen were not immune to this trend.
Loud. Bayley then is interviewed by Charlie Caruso to a loud chorus of boos.
This was my point. To me, I got kind of tired of it because they're always pandering to the fans that, I grew up watching wrestling here in San Jose and I sat in that chair and I was,
And so there's going to be some there's going to be some people critical of they screwed up. Now they know it. They're trying to fix it. But it would have been nice if they didn't screw up in the first place.
But I don't get the impression there really is any kind of story or direction in mind for Becky Lynch.
What had been seen as one of the brightest stars of hope in the future of WWE was quickly deteriorating into disappointment. None of it fell on the women, who all performed at a high level and did what they could with the material that was given to them. Much of the complaints came to the writing staff of WWE and the questionable booking decisions they have made. From Charlotte and Sasha Banks trading the Raw Women's Championship over and over again, both losing in their hometowns, to Becky Lynch being made to look foolish in her feuds on SmackDown Live, the tide was turning for the worst in the women's revolution. One person who seemed to be exempt was Bayley, who remained on NXT to pass the torch to the new generation of women wrestlers down at Full Sail University. After losing the Women's Championship to Asuka, Bayley was destined to head to the main roster. Her debut was highly anticipated and met with high praise, as Bayley's character was seen as a cash cow for WWE. The woman was genuine in her excitement to be a pro wrestler and achieve her dreams in the WWE. She had genuine fans, especially little girls, who looked at her as a hero. It was seen as nearly impossible for WWE to mishandle such a marketable character.
Are you trying to tell me that Bayley's childhood dream was to be a WWE superstar?
Yet they somehow managed to do it. Currently, Bayley is in fact having the worst time of all of the Four Horsewomen to connect with the audience. A run with the Women's Championship that came way too early, some questionable backstage skits, and the recent embarrassment of a kendo stick on a pole match with Alexa Bliss have all led not only to Bayley's character being seen as less than what she was in NXT, but actually starting to become booed by parts of the audience. It's no better for the other horsewomen as Becky Lynch continues to simply float around the SmackDown Live division. Charlotte seems out of place in her new role, and Sasha Banks is continually beaten up to the point where she looks more like a bust than a boss. However, there is light at the end of the tunnel. It's understandable the frustration with many fans over how the Four Horsewomen have been handled on the main roster. Much more was expected from them, and through no fault of their own, much less is what we got. However, talent ultimately rises in one way or another. While the mishandling of these characters exposes the creative problems with WWE's main roster, it doesn't diminish what we know these 4 women are capable of. We may have hit a bump in the road, but over time, this revolution will become an evolution for these 4 young women whose careers, in a very true sense, are just starting out. Better things are in the future for Bayley, Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, and Charlotte, and we are all just waiting to see the full potential of these groundbreaking performers truly emerge.